The Montana wind did not howl, it moaned. It was a low, sorrowful sound that swept across the endless seas of pale, dried prairie grass, carrying the bitter promise of an early winter. Cora Mamilla stood alone on the warped wooden platform of the Bitterroot Valley train station. The locomotive that had brought her here from Ohio was already a shrinking black smudge against the grey horizon, leaving behind nothing but a plume of fading smoke and a deafening silence. Beside her feet sat a single scuffed leather valise. It contained 3 modest cotton dresses, a pair of sturdy boots, a silver comb that had belonged to her grandmother, and absolutely no money. She was 28 years old, a woman the world had quietly overlooked. When her ailing father passed away, the bank had taken the small house they shared, leaving her with a mountain of medical debts and nowhere to turn. Desperation, cold and biting, had led her to answer an advertisement in a gazette. A man named Arthur Vance, claiming to be a prosperous merchant in Bitterroot, had written her letters filled with promises of a quiet, respectable life. He had sent her a train ticket and asked her to wire him the last of her savings to secure a small property for their future home. Cora had arrived on the 3 o'clock train, her heart trembling with a mixture of terror and fragile hope. Now the sun was dipping below the jagged teeth of the western mountains, casting long, bruised shadows across the dirt road. Arthur Vance had never shown up. The station master, an elderly man with kind but tired eyes, had gently delivered the crushing blow an hour ago. Arthur Vance. Mum Vance is a drifter. He left town 2 weeks ago with a gambling debt and a stolen horse. I'm awful sorry, but he ain't coming back. Cora wrapped her thin woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders, shivering as the evening chill bit through the worn fabric. A heavy, suffocating knot tightened in her chest, but she refused to cry. Tears were a luxury she could no longer afford. She picked up her valise. The small town of Bitterroot lay a mile down the road, a haphazard collection of wooden storefronts and saloons. She could not stay there. A woman alone with no money and no connections was a target. She began to walk. She didn't know where the dirt road led, only that it led away from the town, winding out into the vast, unforgiving expanse of the ranch lands. The air smelled of crushed sagebrush and incoming frost. With every step, the reality of her situation pressed down on her. The road was rutted and uneven, her thin-soled shoes offering little protection against the sharp stones. Hours bled into darkness. The temperature plummeted. Cora's legs grew heavy, her breath pluming in the frigid air. The wind whipped her unbound brown hair across her face. She was exhausted, hungry, and entirely alone under a canopy of cold, indifferent stars. Eventually she saw it, a long split-rail fence running alongside the road, its weathered wood pale in the moonlight. Beyond it, a dirt driveway led up to a large, imposing 2-story farmhouse. There were no lights in the windows. It looked like a ghost ship anchored in a sea of grass. Cora leaned against one of the wooden fence posts, her chest heaving. Just a moment, she told herself. Just a moment to rest. But as she closed her eyes, the exhaustion finally overtook her. Her knees buckled, and she slipped down the rough wood, collapsing into the tall, freezing grass. Darkness pulled her under. Elias Thorne was a man who lived his life in the dark. He preferred it that way. The dark asked no questions. It didn't look at him with pity, and it didn't remind him of the laughter that used to fill his home. He rode his dun gelding Rusty along the fence line of the Broken Creek Ranch. The rhythmic creak of saddle leather and the soft thud of hooves on the dirt were the only sounds he tolerated these days. It had been 14 months since the fever took his wife Martha. 14 months since his heart had turned to stone in his chest. Now he was just a ghost, haunting his own land, working himself from dawn until midnight, so he wouldn't have to think, wouldn't have to feel, wouldn't have to face the empty side of his bed. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, and lean from relentless labour. The brim of his battered Stetson cast a deep shadow over eyes that were the colour of a stormy sky grey, turbulent and immensely tired. Rusty snorted suddenly, tossing his head and sidestepping. "Easy, boy." "What is it?" Elias murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He tightened his grip on the reins, his eyes scanning the darkness along the fence line. Then he saw it. A dark shape huddled in the tall grass near the main gate. Elias swung down from the saddle, his boots crunching on the frost-hardened dirt. He approached cautiously, his hand instinctively resting on the cold iron of the Colt revolver at his hip. As he drew closer, the shape resolved into a figure, a woman. She was curled into a tight ball, her lips pale and trembling. A worn leather bag lay abandoned in the dirt beside her. Elias dropped to his knees. He didn't know who she was or how she had gotten here miles from town, but he knew the Montana cold. It was a silent killer. He pulled off his heavy, fleece-lined canvas coat and draped it over her shivering frame. "Ma'am," he said softly, giving her shoulder a gentle shake. "Ma'am, you can't sleep here. You'll freeze to death." Cora stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. For a moment she thought she was dreaming. A large man was kneeling over her, his face shadowed but his hands rough, calloused, smelling of leather and horses, were surprisingly gentle. "Did you say you're nice? It's Arthur?" she whispered, her voice barely a thread. "No, Mum," Elias said, his brow furrowing. "My name is Elias Thorne. You're on my land." Without waiting for permission, Elias slid his arms under her and lifted her effortlessly. She was alarmingly light, like a bundle of dry kindling. Cora rested her head against his chest, too weak to protest. She could hear the steady, strong beat of his heart through his flannel shirt. It was the first solid grounding thing she had felt in weeks. Elias whistled for Rusty to follow and carried Cora up the long, winding driveway toward the dark farmhouse. He kicked the heavy oak door open with his boot. The inside of the house was marginally warmer than the outside, but it carried a different kind of chill. It smelled of stale air, cold ash, and profound neglect. Elias carried her into the parlour and laid her carefully on a long leather sofa. He struck a match, the sudden flare illuminating the room. He lit a kerosene lamp on the table. The yellow light revealed a room that was large and beautifully built, but utterly devoid of life. Dust coated the surfaces of the dark wood furniture. A child's wooden block lay abandoned in the middle of a faded Persian rug. The massive stone hearth was dark and empty. "Stay here," Elias instructed gruffly. He moved quickly. He brought in an armful of split pine logs from the porch and expertly built a fire in the hearth. Within minutes, the dry wood caught crackling and spitting, casting a warm, flickering orange glow across the room. The scent of burning pine sap filled the air, sharp and comforting. Cora sat up slowly, pulling Elias's heavy coat tighter around herself. She watched him. He moved with a quiet, efficient grace, a man accustomed to hard work and solitude. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice still raspy. I don't know what I would have done." Elias stood up, dusting his large hands on his denim trousers. He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. She had dirt smudged across her cheek, and her brown eyes were wide and haunted, but there was a quiet dignity about her that the circumstances hadn't erased. "How did you end up out by my fence line?" he asked, his tone not unkind but direct. Cora looked down at her hands. The shame of her gullibility burned in her chest, but the exhaustion stripped away her pride. "I came on the train to marry a man named Arthur Vance, but he wasn't there. The station master said he was a drifter. He took my money." Elias's jaw tightened. He knew the type. The frontier was full of men who preyed on vulnerable women back east. "I'm sorry," he said simply. It wasn't a platitude. It was a genuine acknowledgement of her misfortune. Before Cora could reply, a small sound drew her attention. She turned her head toward the doorway. Standing in the shadows was a boy of about 8. He had messy dark hair and eyes that matched Elias's, but his expression was fiercely guarded, almost angry. He was wearing an oversized flannel shirt that hung past his knees. Clinging to his leg, hiding half her face behind his trousers, was a little girl with blonde curls. She couldn't have been older than 5. Her eyes were wide, staring at Cora as if she were an apparition. "Toby, Sarah," Elias said, his voice softening slightly, though a heavy weariness bled into his tone. "Go back to bed. It's late." "Who is she?" Toby demanded, his voice sharp and suspicious. He stepped protectively in front of his little sister. "Is she going to take our things?" "No," Elias sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. She needed help out of the cold. Go to sleep, Toby." Toby didn't move for a long moment, glaring at Cora with a hostility born of fear. Then he grabbed his sister's hand and pulled her away into the darkness of the hallway. Sarah didn't make a sound, not a peep. She just let herself be dragged away. Cora watched them go, her heart aching. There was a thick, suffocating tension in the house, a palpable layer of grief that hung heavier than the dust on the furniture. "They don't take well to strangers," Elias muttered, walking over to the kitchen area to pump some water into a tin cup. He brought it to her. "Sarah hasn't spoken a word since their mother passed away last year. Toby just fights everything." Cora took the cup, her fingers brushing against his rough knuckles. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Thorne." "Don't be," Elias said, abruptly turning his back to the fire. He couldn't stand pity. "You can sleep on the sofa tonight. It's warm by the hearth. I'll take you into town tomorrow, so you can figure out what you want to do." He didn't wait for a reply. He walked out of the parlour, his heavy boots thudding against the hardwood floor, leaving Cora alone with the crackling fire. Cora lay down on the leather sofa, pulling the heavy canvas coat over herself like a blanket. The house was silent again, but it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the silence of a home that had forgotten how to breathe. She thought of the angry boy and the silent little girl. She thought of the man with the grey, tired eyes who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. She had nowhere to go. She had no money, no family, and no prospects. But as she listened to the wind howling against the window panes, safe and warm by the fire, Elias Thorne had built Cora made a silent promise. She would not let this family freeze in their own home. The morning sun broke over the jagged Montana ridges, spilling pale, watery light through the frosted window panes of the parlour. Cora woke to the distant rhythmic thud of an axe splitting wood. She sat up slowly, her muscles aching from the hard leather sofa and the freezing journey of the day before. Elias's heavy canvas coat slid from her shoulders. The house was bitterly cold. The hearth held nothing but white ash and a few stubborn glowing embers. Cora stood, wrapping her thin shawl around her shoulders, and padded softly in her stocking feet toward the kitchen. If the parlour was a testament to neglect, the kitchen was a monument to grief. It was a large, practical space that had clearly once been the beating heart of the home, but now it was a graveyard of unwashed tin plates, a rusted cast-iron skillet, and empty preserve jars. A thick layer of dust coated the large oak dining table. Cora didn't know what time Elias had intended to take her to town, but she knew she could not leave this house in such a state. It wasn't just about earning her keep. It was a deeply ingrained instinct. She was a woman who mended things. She rolled up the sleeves of her worn dress and set to work. She found the water pump at the iron sink and scrubbed the rust from the skillet with a handful of coarse salt. She opened the pantry and found a half-empty sack of flour, a slab of salted bacon wrapped in muslin, and a tin of coffee beans. She built a fire in the belly of the large cast-iron wood stove, the familiar scent of wood smoke and heating metal grounding her. She ground the coffee beans by hand, the sharp, bitter aroma filling the cold air. She sliced the bacon thick and laid it in the skillet, the fat hissing and popping cheerfully. She mixed flour, lard and water into a simple biscuit dough, her hands moving with practiced rhythmic grace. As the scent of frying bacon and brewing coffee drifted through the house, Cora heard the faint creak of floorboards from the hallway. She turned from the stove, wiping her floured hands on a rag. Standing in the doorway were Toby and Sarah. They looked like two wild, frightened creatures. Sarah's blonde hair was a tangled bird's nest, and she was wearing a nightgown that was frayed at the hem. Toby stood slightly in front of her, his small fists clenched at his sides. "Good morning," Cora said softly, keeping her voice low and steady the way one might speak to a startled horse. Toby didn't answer. His grey eyes, so much like his father's, darted to the cast-iron stove, then back to Cora. "What are you doing in our kitchen?" he demanded. "I'm making breakfast," Cora replied simply. She turned back to the stove and used a wooden spatula to pull the crispy bacon from the pan, setting it on a clean tin plate. She poured a measure of the hot bacon grease into her biscuit dough, a trick her grandmother had taught her to make them rich and flaky. "Your father was kind enough to let me sleep by the fire. It's only right I offer something in return." "We don't need your food," Toby said stubbornly, though his stomach betrayed him with a loud, audible rumble. Cora offered a small, knowing smile, but she didn't push him. She pulled 3 mismatched plates from the cupboard, wiped the dust off them, and set them on the edge of the large oak table. She placed 2 hot golden biscuits and 3 strips of bacon on each plate. "I'm going to set this right here," Cora said, stepping back from the table. "I need to fetch some water from the well. If the plates are empty when I get back, I'll know you enjoyed it. If not, I'll feed it to the barn cats." She didn't wait for a response. She grabbed a tin bucket by the door, slipped into her worn shoes, and stepped out onto the back porch. The morning air was sharp as glass, biting at her cheeks. She took her time at the well, drawing the icy water, giving the children space. When she returned to the kitchen 10 minutes later, Toby and Sarah were gone. The 2 plates on the table were entirely spotless. Not a single crumb remained. Cora smiled. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. An hour later, the heavy back door groaned open, and Elias stepped into the kitchen. He brought the scent of frost horses and leather with him. He took off his battered Stetson and went to hang it on the wooden peg by the door, but he stopped dead in his tracks. He stared at the kitchen. The sink was empty of dirty dishes. The oak table was wiped clean, its wood gleaming faintly. The floor had been swept, and sitting in the centre of the table was a plate covered with a clean white cloth alongside a steaming mug of black coffee. Cora emerged from the pantry carrying a broom. She stopped when she saw him, suddenly nervous. He was a formidable man, tall and broad, his presence filling the room. Elias looked from the table to Cora, his brow deeply furrowed. "What is this?" he asked, his voice low. "Breakfast, Mr. Thorne," Cora said, setting the broom aside. "I fed the children as well. They went back upstairs." Elias slowly walked to the table and lifted the cloth. 2 warm biscuits and a generous portion of bacon sat beneath it. He hadn't eaten a hot meal prepared by another human being in over a year. He usually survived on cold beans from a can eaten in the saddle, or burnt toast he charred over the open fire. He looked at Cora, his grey eyes unreadable. "I told you I was taking you to town this morning. The stagecoach leaves Bitterroot at noon." Cora took a deep breath, clasping her hands together to stop them from trembling. "Mr. Thorne, I have no money for a stagecoach. I have no family to return to back east. If you take me to town, I will be sleeping in the street by nightfall." Elias sighed heavily, rubbing a calloused hand over his shadowed jaw. "Ma'am, this is a working ranch, not a charity house. It's no place for a woman from the city." "I am not afraid of hard work," Cora countered, taking a step forward. Her voice found a core of quiet strength. "Look around you, Mr. Thorne. You are working yourself to the bone out in those pastures, but your home is falling apart. Your children are eating cold food and wearing torn clothes. Sarah's hair hasn't been brushed in weeks, and Toby is carrying a burden of anger too heavy for an 8-year-old boy. Elias flinched. The words hit him like a physical blow precisely because they were true. He knew he was failing his children, but the grief was a suffocating blanket he couldn't claw his way out from under. I can help, Cora pleaded softly. Let me stay. Let me be your housekeeper. I don't want a wage, just a roof over my head and food to eat. I can cook. I can mend. I can clean. Give me a month. If I am a burden, you can take me to town then. Elias stared at the steaming cup of coffee. He looked at the clean kitchen, a place he had avoided because the ghost of his wife used to linger so heavily here. But today it just smelled of bacon and soap. It smelled alive. He picked up the coffee and took a long sip. It was perfect. Strong, dark and hot enough to warm the chill in his chest. A month, Elias said gruffly, not looking her in the eye. There's a small room off the back of the pantry. It used to be for the hired help. It's yours. Don't expect any coddling, Miss Miller. We live a hard life out here. A hard life is better than an empty one, Cora replied quietly. Over the next 2 weeks, the rhythm of the Broken Creek Ranch began to shift. It was a slow, subtle change, like the thawing of a frozen river in early spring. Cora threw herself into the work with a quiet, relentless dedication. She scrubbed the hardwood floors on her hands and knees using lye soap until her knuckles were raw, but the wood shone beneath the dust. She hauled heavy cauldrons of boiling water to wash the family's clothes, hanging Elias's heavy denim trousers and the children's small shirts on the line to dry in the crisp prairie wind. She didn't try to force her way into the family's heart. She knew grief was a wild animal. If you cornered it, it would bite. Instead, she became a steady, comforting presence. When Toby came in from the barn with a torn shirt sleeve, Cora didn't scold him. She simply pointed to a wooden chair by the fire. "Sit," she said, threading a needle. She stitched the tear with neat, practically invisible stitches, humming a soft hymnal under her breath. Toby sat rigid, at first expecting a lecture, but when none came, his shoulders slowly relaxed. "Pa says the winter is going to be bad this year," Toby muttered one evening, staring at the fire, as Cora mended his trousers. It was the longest sentence he had spoken to her. "Then we will make sure we have enough firewood and warm soup," Cora replied evenly, biting off the end of her thread. "The cold can't hurt us if the hearth is warm, Toby." He looked at her, his grey eyes searching her face for a lie, but he found none. But it was Sarah who broke Cora's heart the most. The little girl moved through the house like a silent ghost, clutching a ragged rag doll. She watched Cora constantly from around corners and behind doors. One rainy afternoon the house was dark and damp. Cora was in the parlour, sitting on the rug before the fire, attempting to untangle a basket of old knotted knitting yarn she had found in a trunk. She felt a small presence beside her. She didn't look up immediately, not wanting to startle the child. Slowly, Sarah sat down on the rug, a safe distance away. Cora continued to work gently, pulling the knots apart. "This yarn is a stubborn thing," Cora murmured to the fire, not directly at Sarah. "It got all twisted up in the dark. It just needs a little patience to be straightened out." She held out a loop of untangled red yarn. She didn't offer it to Sarah. She just let it rest on the rug between them. Minutes ticked by. The rain lashed against the windows. Then a tiny pale hand reached out and picked up the red yarn. Sarah began to wrap it carefully around her small fingers. Cora smiled inwardly. She reached over to the side table and picked up her grandmother's silver comb. "May I?" Cora asked softly, gesturing to Sarah's tangled blonde curls. Sarah looked at the comb, then at Cora's warm, patient brown eyes. Slowly the little girl turned her back to Cora and sat cross-legged. Cora's heart swelled. She moved closer and began to gently, painstakingly work the comb through the child's matted hair. She didn't pull or tug. She worked from the bottom up her fingers, smoothing the silken strands. It took nearly an hour, but by the end, Sarah's hair fell in soft, shining waves down her back. Sarah reached up and touched her own hair, a look of wonder crossing her face. Without a word, she leaned back, resting her small head against Cora's chest. Cora wrapped her arms around the child, closing her eyes, as a fierce wave of protectiveness washed over her. Elias stood in the shadows of the hallway, frozen. He had come back to the house to retrieve a forgotten ledger. Through the cracked parlour door he saw the flickering firelight. He saw the woman sitting on the rug holding his silent daughter in a gentle embrace. He heard the soft, melodic hum of Cora's voice. It was a sound that hadn't echoed in these walls for over a year. A mother's sound. Elias leaned his forehead against the cold plaster wall, closing his eyes. A strange, painful tightness gripped his throat. The ice around his heart, thick and hardened by 14 months of bitter sorrow, developed its very first microscopic crack. He didn't walk into the parlour. He turned and walked quietly back out into the rain, but for the first time in a long time, the heavy weight on his shoulders felt just a fraction lighter. The crisp bite of late October hung over the Broken Creek ranch, stripping the last of the golden leaves from the cottonwood trees along the riverbank. Inside the farmhouse, however, the brutal chill of the coming winter was held at bay. The kitchen smelled of warm yeast-roasted apples and wood smoke. Cora pulled a heavy iron Dutch oven from the stove, flipping a perfectly baked loaf of sourdough bread onto a cooling rack. At the thick oak table, Toby was attempting to carve a small wooden horse out of a block of pine with a dull pocket knife, his tongue poking out the corner of his mouth in deep concentration. Sarah sat beside him, carefully dressing her rag doll in a new, albeit slightly lopsided calico dress Cora had sewn for her from scrap fabric. It was a domestic tranquility that would have been unimaginable just 4 weeks ago. Cora wiped her brow with the back of her flour-dusted hand, allowing herself a small, secret smile. She was tired. Her hands were calloused, and her back ached at the end of every day, but her heart was fuller than it had been in years. This house, these children, and even the gruff, shadow-haunted man who worked the land that they had anchored her drifting soul. The peace was shattered by the sharp, chaotic barking of the ranch dogs outside, followed by the heavy rattle of a carriage coming up the long dirt driveway. Cora looked out the frosted window. A sleek, black enclosed buggy, pulled by 2 well-groomed match bays, came to a halt near the porch. It was a vehicle that belonged on the cobbled streets of a wealthy city, not in the rugged mud of a working cattle ranch. Toby dropped his wooden horse, his small body instantly tensing. "It's Uncle Harlan," he muttered, the hostility returning to his grey eyes in a flash. He grabbed Sarah's hand. "Come on, Sarah, we're going upstairs." Cora watched the children flee with a sinking feeling in her chest. A moment later, the heavy front door opened without a knock. Heavy, purposeful footsteps echoed down the hallway, and a man strode into the kitchen. Harlan Thorne bore a passing resemblance to Elias. He had the same dark hair and tall frame, but where Elias was weathered and hardened by the land, Harlan was soft, slick, and polished. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, a silver pocket watch chain draped across his vest, and a bowler hat that he did not bother to remove. He looked around the clean kitchen, his nose wrinkling slightly, as if the smell of fresh bread offended him. His pale eyes landed on Cora. "Well now," Harlan drawled, his voice smooth and entirely devoid of warmth. "Elias didn't mention he hired a new maid, though knowing my brother's current financial state, I'm surprised he can afford to feed you, let alone pay you." Cora stood taller, wiping her hands on her apron. "I am Cora Miller, and Mr. Thorne is out by the south pasture fixing the fence line. He should be back shortly. I'll wait in the parlour," Harlan said, dismissively turning on his heel. "Bring me a cup of coffee, girl, and make sure the cup is actually clean." Cora's jaw tightened, but she silently poured a cup of the strong, dark coffee and brought it to the parlour. Harlan had already made himself comfortable in Elias's worn leather armchair, tossing a thick leather briefcase onto the mahogany table. 20 minutes later, the back door slammed. Elias walked in, covered in a layer of pale dust and smelling of horse sweat and cold wind. He stopped in the hallway as he saw the black buggy outside his shoulders, slumping under an invisible weight. When Elias entered the parlour, the air in the room grew instantly suffocating. "Harlan," Elias said, his voice flat exhausted. He didn't offer his hand. "You're a long way from Bozeman." "Hello, little brother," Harlan replied, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "I wouldn't have made the trip out to this godforsaken mud pit if it wasn't urgent." "Sit down. You look like you're about to drop dead." Elias remained standing, leaning heavily against the doorframe. "Say your piece, Harlan. I have cattle that need moving before the snow hits." Harlan sighed, setting the coffee down and unbuckling his leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bound with a red ribbon. "I'm here to save you from yourself, Elias. The bank in Helena is calling in the notes on the land. You missed the last 2 payments. They were going to foreclose by November." Elias's face paled beneath the dirt and stubble. "I told them I needed an extension until the spring calf sale. The herd is healthy. I can make the money." "The bank doesn't care about your calves, Elias," Harlan said smoothly, leaning forward. "But I do. That's why I bought your debt." Elias froze, his grey eyes darkening like thunderclouds. "You did what?" "I bought the promissory notes," Harlan stated, tapping the stack of papers. "I own the debt on Broken Creek now, and I am not a charity institution. I have an offer from the Pacific Northwest logging conglomerate. They want the timber rights on the upper ridge, and they want the valley for a new rail spur. They are offering a fortune, Elias. Enough to clear your debt pay off the suppliers and leave you with enough cash to move into town and buy a decent little house for you and the brats." "No!" Elias growled, stepping into the room, his fists clenched. "This ranch belonged to our father. It's my home. It's my children's home. I'm not selling it to a logging company so they can strip the trees and leave the land bleeding." "It's not your land anymore, Elias," Harlan snapped, dropping his polite facade. "It's a graveyard you've been drowning ever since Martha died. Look at yourself. You're working yourself into an early grave. The house was a rotting shell until you hired that girl to clean it, and you're buried in debt. Sign the papers, Elias. If you don't, I will foreclose on you myself, and you will walk away with absolutely nothing." In the kitchen, standing perfectly still by the open doorway, Cora listened to every word. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She looked up at the ceiling, knowing Toby and Sarah were huddled up there, terrified of the loud voices, terrified of the uncle, who looked at them like they were bothersome insects. Elias stood in the parlour, staring at the legal documents on the table. The fight seemed to drain out of him all at once, leaving behind a hollow, broken shell of a man. The sheer crushing weight of his grief, his exhaustion and his financial ruin crashed down upon him. He had tried so hard to hold it all together, but he was just one man. "I need time," Elias whispered, his voice cracking. He sounded older, defeated. "You have until Friday," Harlan said, standing up and brushing a speck of dust from his tailored lapel. "I'll be staying at the hotel in Bitterroot. Come to town, sign the deed over to the conglomerate, and I'll give you the cheque for the remainder. Don't be a fool, Elias. You've already lost your wife. Don't make your children sleep in the snow." Harlan walked out of the parlour, completely ignoring Cora as he passed through the kitchen. The front door shut loudly, and a moment later the carriage rattled away down the dirt road. The silence that followed was agonising. Cora walked slowly into the parlour. Elias had collapsed into the leather armchair, his elbows resting on his knees, his face buried in his rough, dirt-stained hands, his broad shoulders hitched in a silent, jagged breath. It was the posture of a man who had finally surrendered. "Elias," Cora said, softly, using his first name for the very first time. He didn't look up. You should start packing your things, Cora. He rasped, his voice raw and thick with unshed tears. I'll pay you whatever I have left in the lockbox. It should be enough to get you a train ticket back east or a room in town. I'm losing the ranch. Cora felt a surge of hot, fierce anger, not at Elias, but at the unfairness of the world, at the cruelty of Harlan, and at the thought of those two little children losing the only sanctuary they had left. She had lost her home once. She refused to watch it happen to this family. She walked across the room and stood directly in front of him. I am not packing my things, Cora said, her voice ringing with a quiet, undeniable authority. Elias slowly lifted his head, his grey eyes red-rimmed and filled with a despair that broke her heart. Cora, you heard him. He holds the notes. The bank sold me out. I don't have the money. If I don't sell to the logging company, he'll take it all anyway. He said you missed 2 payments. Cora passed rest, kneeling on the faded Persian rug so she was eye-level with him. How much are the payments, Elias? And how much do you owe the suppliers? Elias rubbed his face tiredly. It doesn't matter. The ledgers are a mess. I haven't been able to look at the numbers since Martha got sick. I just kept buying feed on credit and hoping the calf sale would cover it. It does matter, Cora insisted gently. Before my father died, he was drowning in medical debts. I handled his books for 5 years. I know how to read a ledger, Elias. I know how banks calculate interest, and I know how men like your brother hide their greed behind complicated numbers. Elias stared at her, seeing the fierce, unwavering fire in her brown eyes. She was a woman who had been thrown away by the world, left shivering by a fence line. Yet here she was, offering to stand between his family and a firing squad. Please, Cora whispered, reaching out to gently touch his calloused hand. Let me look at the books. What do we have to lose? Elias looked at her small, warm hand resting over his. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the faint scent of wood smoke and vanilla from her skin grounding him in the chaotic storm of his mind. They're in the roll-top desk in the corner, he said, his voice barely a murmur. That night, after Elias had retreated to the barn and the children were fast asleep in their beds, Cora sat alone in the parlour. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes with the threat of an incoming storm. The fire in the hearth snapped and popped, casting dancing shadows against the walls. The heavy oak desk was covered in a chaotic mountain of paper-faded receipts, unpaid invoices from the mercantile scribbled notes on feed prices, and 3 thick, leather-bound ledger books. Cora poured herself a cup of black coffee, trimmed the wick on the kerosene lamp, and opened the first ledger. For hours the only sounds in the house were the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and the soft scratch of Cora's pencil on a blank sheet of paper. She organised the chaos. She separated the critical debts from the flexible ones. She cross-referenced the feed costs with the projected market value of Elias's cattle that he had written on a scrap of paper. Around 2 a.m, her eyes burning and her fingers cramped, Cora stopped. She stared at the numbers she had carefully aligned in neat, disciplined columns. Harlan had lied. It was true that Elias was behind on his payments, but the ranch wasn't hopelessly bankrupt. The equity in the land and the current size of the healthy herd far outweighed the debt Harlan had purchased. Harlan was trying to panic Elias into a quick sale because the logging company was offering a massive payout and Harlan wanted to pocket the difference. If Elias could just make a partial payment to show good faith, he could legally demand a restructuring of the loan. But they needed cash. Hard, immediate cash to stop the foreclosure before Friday. And Elias's bank accounts were entirely empty. Cora leaned back in the wooden chair, rubbing her aching temples. She looked around the quiet sleeping house. She thought of Toby's tentative smiles, of Sarah's soft blonde hair, and of Elias's tired, honourable eyes. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the small velvet pouch she kept pinned to the inside of her dress. She opened it and tipped the contents into her palm. In the flickering lamplight, the silver comb that had belonged to her grandmother gleamed softly. It was antique, heavily chased silver with 3 small embedded sapphires. It was her only connection to her past, the only thing of value she possessed in the entire world. Cora closed her fingers around the cold silver. She didn't hesitate. A comb was just an object. This house, this family, was a home, and a home was worth fighting for. The Montana sky did not merely darken, it bruised. A sickly purplish-grey hue swallowed the morning sun, and the temperature plummeted so violently that the remaining leaves on the oak trees froze and shattered like glass. It was Thursday morning. Harlan Thorne had returned to Broken Creek a day early, driving his black buggy furiously up the dirt road. He claimed he had forgotten to bring a crucial addendum for Elias to sign, but the nervous twitch in his jaw suggested he simply wanted the deed secured before the ominous clouds broke. He was too late. 10 minutes after Harlan stepped into the parlour, the sky tore open. It wasn't a gentle snowfall, it was a blinding, roaring wall of white. The wind shrieked across the open plains, slamming into the farmhouse with the force of a physical blow. Within half an hour, the dirt road disappeared under a foot of drifting snow. They were entirely, utterly isolated. "This is madness," Harlan shouted, pacing the length of the parlour, his slick leather shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood. "My train leaves Bozeman tomorrow evening. I cannot be trapped in this rotting icebox." Elias stood by the frosted window, ignoring his brother completely. His grey eyes were fixed on the blinding whiteout, his face pale and tight with sheer terror. "The heifers," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. "The pregnant heifers are still in the lower pasture. If they stay out there, the snow will bury them." Elias turned, his movements frantic. He grabbed his heavy canvas coat from the wooden peg, shoving his arms into the sleeves. He pulled a thick woolen scarf around his neck and reached for his leather gloves. "Elias, don't be a fool," Harlan scoffed, stopping his pacing. "You can't go out in that. You won't be able to see your own hands. Let the stupid beast freeze. The logging conglomerate is paying you for the land, not the cattle." Elias paused, his hand on the brass doorknob. He looked at Harlan, a lifetime of disappointment settling heavily on his broad shoulders. "This is a ranch, Harlan, and I am a rancher. You sit by the fire and count your imaginary money. I have lives to save." As Elias pulled the heavy door open, a violent gust of snow blasted into the hallway. But before he could step out, a hand grabbed his arm. He turned. It was Cora. She had discarded her apron and was wearing one of his old oversized flannel shirts over her dress, a heavy woolen shawl wrapped securely around her head and shoulders. She was pulling on a pair of Toby's thick winter mittens. "I'm coming with you," she said, her voice steady and loud enough to cut through the roar of the wind. "No!" Elias shouted back, pushing the door against the gale. "Cora, it's 50 below zero out there. You'll die. You cannot herd 20 terrified heifers into the barn by yourself in a whiteout," Cora countered, her brown eyes flashing with fierce determination. "I can open the gates. I can guide them. You need help, Elias. Now, let's go." For a second, Elias just stared at her. He saw the iron will beneath her delicate frame. He didn't have time to argue. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive motion. They stepped off the porch and were instantly swallowed by the storm. It was a waking nightmare of ice and blinding wind. The cold bit into Cora's lungs like shattered glass. She couldn't see the barn, which was only 50 yards away. She could only follow the massive dark shape of Elias as he trudged forward, breaking a path through snow that was already thigh-deep. He kept a brutal grip on her wrist, refusing to let the wind tear her away. They reached the lower pasture. The heifers were huddled against the frozen fence line, their coats caked in thick ice, crying out in pitiful, terrified bleats. For an hour they fought a war against nature. Elias used his sheer physical strength to push the stubborn, freezing animals toward the barn. Cora stood by the heavy wooden doors, fighting the wind to keep them open, calling out to the cattle, her voice hoarse and freezing in her throat. Just as the last heifer stumbled into the warm, hay-scented safety of the barn, Elias shouted. Through the blinding snow, Cora saw a small, dark shape lying motionless near the fence. A calf. It had collapsed too weak to fight the snow. Elias waded through the drift, dropping to his knees. He scooped the heavy, freezing animal into his arms, but his legs, exhausted from the brutal effort, buckled. He slipped into the snowbank. Cora didn't think. She threw herself into the storm, wading through the deep snow, until she reached him. She grabbed the collar of his heavy coat, pulling with all her meagre strength. "Get up, Elias!" she screamed over the wind. "Get up!" Elias looked up. Through the swirling ice, he saw her face red with cold, her eyelashes caked in frost, but her eyes burning with an unyielding fire. She wasn't just fighting for the calf, she was fighting for him. With a guttural roar, Elias found his footing. Together they half-carried, half-dragged the calf into the barn, slamming the heavy wooden doors shut behind them and dropping the iron latch. The silence inside the barn was deafening. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool, sweet hay, and animal heat. Elias and Cora collapsed onto a pile of straw, their chests heaving, their bodies trembling violently. Elias looked over at Cora. Her shawl had fallen back, her dark hair plastered to her freezing cheeks. She was shivering uncontrollably, but she was looking at the calf, which was slowly getting to its feet, bleating for its mother. Slowly, Elias reached out and took her freezing, mittened hands in his large, leather-clad ones. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The profound, overwhelming gratitude in his storm-grey eyes spoke volumes. In the freezing darkness of the barn, a silent vow was forged between them. When they finally fought their way back to the farmhouse, the contrast was jarring. Cora immediately took charge. She stripped off her frozen outer layers, her fingers numb and clumsy. She ignored Harlan, who was sitting comfortably in Elias's leather armchair, a glass of Elias's scarce whiskey in his hand. "Toby!" Cora called out, her voice raspy. "Fetch some dry blankets from the upstairs chest. Bring them to the parlour." She pushed Elias toward the hearth. "Sit!" she ordered. She grabbed a thick towel and began to aggressively rub the melting snow from his dark hair. Elias sat frozen, completely stunned by her commanding presence. He let her tend to him, closing his eyes, as the heat of the fire and the rough friction of the towel began to thaw his blood. "Touching truly," Harlan sneered from the armchair, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "A beautiful little frontier romance. But it doesn't change the facts, Elias. You're dragging this poor woman into your icy grave. The moment this storm breaks, the bank takes it all." Cora stopped drying Elias's hair. She slowly turned to face Harlan, the firelight casting long, dangerous shadows across her face. "You talk a great deal about facts, Mr. Thorne," Cora said, her voice dropping to a deadly quiet register. "So let us discuss them. The fact is, the debt you purchased does not exceed the value of the land or the herd. The fact is, the bank cannot legally foreclose without allowing a grace period for a partial payment, which you conveniently neglected to mention." Harlan stopped swirling his whiskey. He sat up, his pale eyes narrowing. "What are you blathering about, girl?" "I'm talking about the ledgers," Cora said, taking a step toward him. "I spent all of last night auditing your brother's books. You're trying to panic him into a rush sale to the logging conglomerate so you can pocket the difference. It is a pathetic, desperate swindle, and it will not work." Elias stared at Cora, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at Harlan, whose face had flushed an ugly, guilty red. "You have no idea what you're talking about. You ignorant little maid," Harlan spat, standing up. "I know how to read numbers," Cora countered, standing her ground completely unbothered by his anger. "And I know we are not signing your deed. When the snow clears, we are going to Helena, and we are paying the arrears." "With what?" Harlan laughed, a harsh barking sound. "He doesn't have a dime." Cora reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out the small velvet pouch. She opened it, letting the silver and sapphire comb fall into her palm. "With this," she said softly, "it is an antique. The sapphires alone will cover the missed payments until the spring calf sale. Elias stood up abruptly. Cora, no. That's your grandmother's. It's all you have left of your family. Cora looked back at Elias, her eyes shining with unshed tears, but her smile was profound and entirely peaceful. Family isn't something you carry in your pocket, Elias. It's the people you stand by when the storm hits. Harlan opened his mouth to argue, but Elias took a menacing step forward, his massive frame blocking the firelight. Shut your mouth, Harlan, Elias growled, his voice vibrating with a terrifying protective fury. Say one more word to her and I will throw you out into the snow myself. Harlan swallowed hard, looking at the sheer violence in his brother's eyes. He sat back down in the armchair, his face pale, finally defeated. The storm raged violently into the night. The temperature dropped further, causing the oil in the lamps to freeze. The only source of light and heat was the massive stone hearth in the parlour. They dragged mattresses down from the bedrooms, laying them out on the Persian rug to stay close to the fire. Harlan sat in the furthest corner, wrapped in a blanket, sulking in absolute silence. Toby and Sarah lay on a mattress closest to the hearth. The howling wind was terrifying, shaking the very foundations of the old house. Sarah was trembling, her small hands clutching her rag doll so tightly her knuckles were white. She squeezed her eyes shut, terrified of the monstrous sounds outside. Cora sat on the edge of their mattress. She reached out and gently stroked Sarah's blonde hair. It's just the wind, sweet girl, Cora murmured softly. It's angry because it can't get inside. It can't hurt you. The fire is too strong. Sarah didn't open her eyes, but she leaned her head against Cora's knee. Cora took a slow breath and began to sing. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear, sweet, and perfectly pitched. She sang an old, mournful lullaby about the Shenandoah River, a song her own mother had sung to her when she was a child. The melody floated through the cold, dark room, a delicate ribbon of warmth that wrapped around the frightened children. Toby's tense shoulders slowly relaxed, his breathing deepening as sleep finally overtook him. But Sarah stayed awake. She opened her large grey eyes and looked up at Cora. Cora smiled down at her, continuing to hum the melody softly, her hand gently stroking the child's cheek. Then a sound broke the silence. It was tiny, raspy from disuse, and as fragile as a pane of winter ice. Sing it again. Cora's breath hitched in her throat. Her hand froze on Sarah's cheek. She stared down at the little girl, fresh tears instantly welling in her eyes. Across the room, sitting in the shadows by the hearth, Elias heard it. He slowly lowered his face into his hands. His broad shoulders began to shake. He didn't make a sound, but the tears he had held back for 14 brutal, agonizing months finally fell. They fell for his dead wife, for his own failures, and for the sheer, overwhelming relief of hearing his daughter's voice. Cora looked up and saw Elias weeping silently in the dark. She didn't look away. She simply reached out her other hand toward him. Elias moved from the shadows. He crawled across the rug and sat beside Cora, his massive hand wrapping around her small one, holding it as if it were the only tether keeping him from floating away into the storm. Cora swallowed her own tears and smiled down at the little girl. I will sing it as many times as you like, Sarah, Cora whispered. Outside, the Montana winter raged and screamed, trying to bury the world in ice. But inside the Broken Creek farmhouse, the cold had finally been defeated. A family had been entirely perfectly mended. The wind, which had screamed like a wounded animal for 2 days and 2 nights, finally died just before dawn on Saturday morning. In its wake, it left a silence so absolute and profound that it made the ears ring. Cora woke to the smell of fresh coffee and the soft, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. The brutal cold that had threatened to consume the house had retreated, replaced by the steady, comforting heat of the roaring parlour hearth. She opened her eyes slowly. The parlour was bathed in an ethereal, blindingly bright light, reflecting off the fresh snow outside the windows. The world had been wiped clean. Sarah was still asleep, her small head resting trustingly against Cora's chest, her blonde curls spilling over Cora's woolen shawl. Toby was curled up on the opposite side of the mattress, his breathing deep, and even one arm thrown protectively over his sister's feet. Cora gently untangled herself from the children, ensuring the heavy quilts were tucked securely under their chins. She stood up, her muscles stiff from sleeping on the floor, and turned toward the kitchen. Elias was already there. He was standing by the cast-iron stove, dressed in his heavy denim trousers and a fresh flannel shirt. He held a tin cup of steaming coffee in his large, calloused hands. He looked up as Cora entered, and for the first time since she had met him by that frozen fence line, the storm was entirely gone from his grey eyes. They were clear, calm, and anchored. "The snow stopped," Elias said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that sent a sudden, unexpected warmth straight down to Cora's toes. "I saw," Cora replied softly, walking over to the stove to pour herself a cup. "Did the cattle make it?" "Jedediah and the ranch hands made it up from the bunkhouse at first light." Elias nodded, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "We dug out the barn doors. The heifers are safe. The calf we brought in is nursing. We didn't lose a single head." Cora closed her eyes, letting out a long, trembling breath of relief. Thank God! The quiet peace of the kitchen was abruptly shattered by the sound of heavy boots stomping down the wooden staircase. Harlan Thorne appeared in the doorway, looking entirely out of place. His expensive charcoal suit was terribly wrinkled, his hair was dishevelled, and his pale eyes were bloodshot from 2 nights of sleeping in a freezing, draughty guest bedroom. He glared at Elias, shivering violently despite the warmth radiating from the stove. "Have your men dig out my buggy," Harlan demanded, his voice tight with barely suppressed rage. "I have a train to catch in Bozeman, and I am not spending another minute in this wretched, God-forsaken icebox." Elias slowly set his tin cup down on the oak table. He turned to face his brother. His broad shoulders squared his posture, radiating a quiet, dangerous authority. He was no longer the exhausted, broken widower Harlan had cornered just days ago. He was the master of Broken Creek, and he had found his footing. "Jedediah already hitched your bays, Harlan," Elias said, his tone dangerously flat. "Your buggy is waiting at the end of the porch. The road to Bitterroot is broken enough for you to get through, if you ride the ruts." Harlan sneered, adjusting his wrinkled lapels. "Excellent. I will expect you at the bank on Monday morning to sign the deed over. Don't think a little snowstorm changes the facts, Elias. You are still broke, and you still owe me." "I'm not going to the bank on Monday, Harlan," Elias stated, simply crossing his arms over his broad chest. "I am going today, and I am not signing anything over to your logging conglomerate." Harlan barked a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "Are you deaf, Elias? You don't have the money to cover the arrears." He pointed a shaking, accusatory finger at Cora, who stood quietly by the sink. "And don't tell me you are actually going to let this little stray sell her baubles to pay your debts. The bank will laugh you out of town." Elias didn't flinch. He took 2 slow, deliberate steps toward his brother. Harlan instinctively took a step back, suddenly very aware of the sheer physical size and strength of the man standing before him. "You listen to me, and you listen to me well, Harlan," Elias growled, his voice dropping to a deadly vibrating whisper. "You came into my home when I was bleeding, and you tried to steal the land our father built. You tried to throw my children out into the snow to line your own pockets. That ends today." Elias reached over to the table and picked up the thick, leather-bound ledger Cora had meticulously organised, along with a heavy envelope. He tossed them onto the table so they slid and stopped right in front of Harlan. Cora went through the books. Elias continued, his grey eyes flashing with cold fire. She itemised the herd. She calculated the equity. Even with the missed payments, the value of the spring calf sale covers the debt 3 times over. "I'm taking this ledger to Thomas Albright, at the First National in Helena. Thomas was a friend of our father. When he sees how you tried to fraudulently panic me into a fire sale, he won't just restructure my loan, he'll likely report you to the State Banking Commission." Harlan stared at the ledger, his face draining of all colour, until it matched the snow outside the window. His mouth opened and closed silently like a landed fish. He knew Albright. He knew the man despised predatory lending. If Elias showed him those perfectly balanced ledgers, Harlan's scheme would not only collapse, it could ruin his reputation in Bozeman entirely. You wouldn't," Harlan stammered, his slick confidence completely evaporating. "Get out of my house," Elias commanded, his voice echoing off the wooden walls, hard and unyielding as iron. "Get off my land, and if you ever show your face near my children, or Cora, again, I won't bother with the law. I'll bury you out in the deep woods, where the wolves can't even find you." Harlan didn't say another word. He turned, grabbed his bowler hat from the hall tree with trembling hands, and fled out the front door. A moment later, the sharp crack of a whip and the frantic jingling of carriage harnesses signalled his departure. The heavy silence returned to the kitchen, but this time it was a clean, victorious silence. Elias let out a long breath, rubbing the back of his neck. He turned to look at Cora. She was watching him, her brown eyes shining with profound pride. "I have to ride to Helena," Elias said softly, moving toward the hallway to grab his heavy winter coat. "The roads will be treacherous, but I have to get this ledger to Albright before the bank closes for the weekend." Cora walked over to him. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the small velvet pouch containing her grandmother's silver and sapphire comb. She pressed it firmly into his large hand. "Take this," she insisted gently. "Just in case Mr. Albright is stubborn, it is enough to secure a line of credit to hold the ranch until the spring sale. Please, Elias, let me do this for the family." Elias looked down at the velvet pouch in his palm, then up at Cora's earnest, beautiful face. His jaw tightened with emotion. He didn't want to take her only possession, but he knew the pride and love behind the gesture. He slowly closed his fingers around it, nodding once. "I'll be back by nightfall," he promised. The day passed in a quiet blur of domestic chores. Cora felt a strange humming energy beneath her skin. The storm was over, the villain was vanquished, and the ranch was safe. Yet an agonizing question hovered over her heart. She had begged for a month to prove her worth as a housekeeper. She had saved the ranch, but what happened now? Did she just go back to scrubbing floors and hiding in the small room off the pantry? Did she belong here, truly? Or was she just a temporary bandage on a wound that had finally healed? Evening fell, painting the snow-covered plains in brilliant strokes of lavender and gold. Toby and Sarah were sitting on the parlour rug, playing a quiet game of checkers. Sarah was actually giggling a soft musical sound that made Cora's heart soar every time she heard it. The heavy front door clicked open, and the stomping of snow-covered boots echoed in the hall. Cora stood up quickly from her rocking chair by the fire, smoothing her apron over her simple cotton dress. Elias walked into the parlour. He looked exhausted, his face red from the biting wind, but there was a brilliant, unmistakable light in his eyes. He took off his Stetson and hung his coat. He walked straight past the fire, straight past the children, and stopped right in front of Cora. Without a word, he reached into his breast pocket and pulled out the small velvet pouch. He held it out to her. Cora stared at it, her heart sinking slightly. "Mr. Albright wouldn't take it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Did he refuse the loan?" "Albright didn't even look at the comb," Elias said, his voice thick with emotion. He gently took her hand and placed the pouch back into her palm, folding her fingers over it. He looked at the ledgers. He said he hadn't seen bookkeeping that meticulous in 20 years. He gave me a loan extension on the spot, based entirely on the projected value of the herd and the sheer competence of the woman running my accounts. Cora gasped softly, a wave of profound relief washing over her. "Oh, Elias, That is wonderful news. The ranch is truly safe. The ranch is safe, Elias agreed softly. He didn't let go of her hand. In fact, he reached out with his other hand and gently took her other one, holding both of her small, calloused hands in his large, warm ones. He looked down at her, his grey eyes stripping away all the walls, all the defences he had built over the last 14 months. When I rode out to the fence line that night, Elias began, his voice dropping to a low, intimate murmur that was meant only for her, I was a dead man walking. I was just waiting for the cold to take me. I thought my heart had been buried in the churchyard. I thought my home was just a house made of dead wood. Cora looked up at him, her breath catching in her throat, her brown eyes wide and shining with unshed tears. You didn't just save my ranch, Cora, Elias whispered, stepping a fraction of an inch closer, pulling her gently into his orbit. You brought my children back to life. You made Sarah speak. You took away Toby's anger. You built a fire in a hearth that I thought would be cold forever. I just wanted to help. Cora breathed, a single tear slipping down her cheek. I didn't have anywhere else to go. Elias lifted one hand and gently, reverently brushed the tear away with his rough thumb. His touch was incredibly tender. You have somewhere to go, Elias said, his voice trembling with a fierce, beautiful sincerity. You belong here, but not as a housekeeper, Cora. God knows I could never let you be just a hired hand in this house. He took a deep breath, laying his soul completely bare. I don't have fancy words. I'm just a rancher. I smell like horses I work too hard, and I have scars that run deep. But I love you. My children love you. I want you to stay, Cora. I want you to be my wife. I want you to be the mother of my children and the heart of this family for as long as we both draw breath. Cora stood perfectly still, the entire world narrowing down to the grey eyes of the man standing before her. All her life she had been forgotten. She had been a burden, a victim of circumstance, an abandoned bride left to freeze at a lonely train station. But here, in the warm glow of the firelight, holding the hands of a man who was as steady and enduring as the Montana mountains, she knew she had finally found the end of her long, lonely road. Yes, Cora whispered, a brilliant, radiant smile breaking across her face as the tears flowed freely. Yes, Elias, I will stay. This is my home. Elias let out a breath that sounded like a ragged laugh. He pulled her against his chest, wrapping his strong arms around her, burying his face in her dark hair. He held her tight as if she were the most precious thing in the entire world, anchoring her, protecting her, loving her. Pa, Elias and Cora pulled back slightly, looking down. Toby was standing next to them, looking up with wide, hopeful eyes. Sarah was right behind him, clutching her rag doll. Are you staying, Miss Cora? Toby asked, his voice entirely devoid of the harshness it once held. Are you really going to stay with us forever? Cora knelt down on the rug, opening her arms. I am staying forever, Toby, if you'll have me. Toby didn't hesitate. He threw his arms around Cora's neck, burying his face in her shoulder. A second later, Sarah scrambled forward and wrapped her small arms around Cora's waist. Elias knelt down beside them, wrapping his massive arms around all three of them, pulling his family, his whole beautifully mended family, into a tight, unbreakable embrace. The winter wind would eventually return to the Bitterroot Valley. The snows would deepen, and the years would bring new hardships and trials, as the frontier always did. But inside the walls of the Broken Creek farmhouse, the fire in the hearth would never go out again. A stranded, forgotten woman had walked out of the freezing dark, and in her hands she had brought the dawn.